Something worth consideration. Are you just a bigot? Is that really all it is? Are you just trapped in some kind of backward, ignorant, closed-minded thinking, and you're not willing to get with the times? After all, times have always changed. There was slavery once. And look how far we've come when it comes to racism. And now, if you can believe it, even women are allowed to vote. So when you sit here and you oppose the LGBTQ agenda, and you oppose the woke agenda, doesn't that make you just like all of the bigots and reactionaries of time past? This is probably the most common form of gaslighting liberals like to use against anyone who would stand in the way of their agenda. They make it seem like whatever bizarre, inhuman, and even satanic agenda they're pushing is just part of some kind of progress of history, or worse, some kind of unstoppable tide of history that's vain to oppose. But this couldn't be farther from the truth. As we're seeing in the country and even all around the world, it's the liberals who are showing themselves to be the true reactionaries, unable to cope with the fact that their woke agenda is becoming increasingly intolerable for human beings in general. And they're the ones who are trying to shut their ears and close their eyes to the obvious fact that the tides are pointing in the direction of wokeness being thrown into the dustbin of history forever. Well, what is wokeness anyway? Liberals will just tell you it's progress, and that if you stand against it, you're no different than any other bigot throughout history who tried to stop historical change. But if it was just progress, why does it need to be spread in such an artificial way? Why does it need to be created in these elite universities while being funded by the money of the ruling class, all the while being spread by the CIA and being promoted on mainstream media? You'd think that if it was just progress, it would have a more organic basis, but it doesn't. The truth of the matter is that the woke agenda is something that's being enforced, sometimes even at gunpoint. Don't believe me? Ask people like Chaya Raichik, creator of Libs of TikTok, who, in addition to being doxxed, regularly receives thousands of death threats just for shedding some light, even without her own commentary, mind you, on the progressive future the wokes have in store for ordinary Americans. The truth is that it's becoming increasingly normal for Americans to have to face penalties for even slightly questioning wokeness. From getting fired from your job to getting beaten by these new black shirt thugs that are calling themselves Antifa. So, despite having all of the powers at their disposal to alter public opinion, they still need to resort to violence and coercion to enforce it. That doesn't seem like progress to me, but a ruling class desperate to enforce its views on a population that finds them incompatible with their own humanity. This brings us to the main point. Just what is progress in the first place? Because just from the way people even think about this word, you'd think history was some kind of line, beginning from a backward and ignorant past to an enlightened and progressive future. Now, obviously, some kind of progress is occurring throughout history. After all, we can very clearly see signs of technological progress and progress when it comes to increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization. The problem is that whatever model of progress you want to look at that can be realistically measured across history, there's nothing actually progressive about wokeness. It's not like wokeness is ushering in a new age of technology. Actually, woke people are going to be the most likely to oppose technological change. Don't believe me? Take a survey of woke people and ask them what they think about AI art, and almost all of them are going to have some kind of neo-Luddite reactionary view. And that's not to mention their views on environmentalism and degrowth. And as for increasingly sophisticated forms of social organization, they do everything in their power to suppress the organic development of new social formations that aren't under their control in an increasingly decentralized information age. So woke people can't really get away with this idea that they represent a high ground of progress. They don't represent any of the things that correspond to real historical change and real historical progress. On the contrary, all woke people are doing is retarding historical change. That actually makes them reactionaries, and it makes them the backward ones. And in case I wasn't clear when I say woke people, I mean all the people trying to enforce some institutional moralism that comes at the expense of our own common sense reality. And I'm actually sure most of you know what I'm talking about. It's the people who expect us to think that non-binary, blue-haired, and morbidly obese woman is beautiful. Not because we actually think they're beautiful, but because it would be politically incorrect not to think that. Or those in general who want us to deny basic facts or sensibilities about reality just because they're ideologically inconvenient. And that's exactly why it has to be enforced, because otherwise, people would be able to trust their basic sensibilities about the world instead. And woke liberalism tells us that these sensibilities can't be trusted, and that we need to take refuge in the institutions and experts instead. And sadly, many dissident rightists and conservatives mistaken this liberalism for Marxism, confusing the authoritarianism of a liberalism, which tries to repress our basic human sensibilities, with that of the Soviet Union and China. But while political repression did indeed exist in all communist states, nothing like wokeness ever did. The culture of communist states, including Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, and especially today's North Korea, has always been profoundly shaped by people's basic sensibilities. No one ever had to question what a woman was in Stalin's Soviet Union. Music, art, and film reflected people's basic tastes in these countries. Nothing like the grotesque abominations of enlightened Western culture ever permeated people's minds. Meanwhile, woke liberals are the ones who tell us we can't trust our own common sense, and that if their progress makes us sick to our stomach, it's because we aren't enlightened enough. After all, weren't slavery and racism common sense at one point? Wokes will have us believe that progressive liberals were the ones who rescued all of humanity from these historical evils, at the expense of the majority. And while that may seem easy to believe, it actually isn't true. Most of what we actually consider historical progress consists in merely rectifying the evils that very same progress ushered in the first place. The truth is that there was nothing progressive about modernity at all when it came to how we treat other human beings on a cultural and moral level. Italian Marxist philosopher Domenico Lacerdo points out very clearly how many of the evils that we associate with the past, such as the savagery and unprecedented barbarity of colonialism, slavery, and racism, actually accompanied what we consider the progress of European modernity. And while these things were indeed overcame and fought against, they were ushered in by the very same liberalism that now claims credit for defeating them. Before liberal modernity, many of the problems progress sought to rectify didn't even exist in the first place. Would feminism ever had to have come into existence had it not been for the way industrial capitalism destroyed the more or less natural gender roles both men and women considered themselves to have? Would critical race theory have ever been invented were it not for the way blind universalism outright disrespects the differences between people? Would the madness of gender theory really exist were it not for the way mass media in the information age has detached us from reality? Wokeness is just the latest form of modern liberalism. And modern liberalism wants to lay the blame for all of humanity's evils and ills squarely on the people and the people's common sense. But the truth is actually that the institutions of the ruling class, and the bourgeoisie in particular, are overwhelmingly responsible for the majority of human evil. The evil of slavery, racism, genocide, and colonialism can squarely be placed on them, not us and our common sense. The people, the common people, never had the sensibility or the stomach for that kind of grotesque evil. It was only people who were privileged enough to venture off and experiment with the limits of human sensibility that allowed them to commit such atrocious evils. The wokes and liberals have it backwards. Human beings at the root level were never actually evil. The problem isn't people like me and you. The problem is people like them. And they've decided to revise history to squarely place the blame on us, as though if we resist their attempt to completely transform us into slaves, we're comparable to all of the evil, bigoted people throughout history that they take credit for having overcome. But the truth is that people like them are actually, more often than not, the ones who are actually the racists and bigots, not us. So to return back to the original question, we're not the bigots. They are. They're bigoted against people's basic sensibilities and common sense. They're the ones trying to preserve institutional liberalism in vain and at the expense of the march of history. So don't let anyone ever tell you that what's going on just represents the changing of the times. It's much more than that. It's much more insidious than that. It's an institutional, liberal ruling class desperately trying to cling to power at all costs. The first step in being able to defeat wokeness is recognizing its root cause. Progress creates the very problems it seeks to rectify, and wokeness is no different. The reason wokeness has been able to take root in society is because of the profound confusion that has plagued the people of both our country and even the world at large. And while a lot of this has to do with the insidious agenda of the ruling class, some of it also has to do with changes in history, changes in technology, and changes in social organization. People don't know how to tap back into their basic human sensibilities. And ironically enough, this is something that Marxism can be useful in allowing people to do once again. Being able to tap back into our basic human traditions that survive the test of time, those basic tried and old wisdoms which allow us to navigate and understand what it means to be a human being within the context of a specific history and a specific civilization, is precisely what Marxism accomplished in countries like the Soviet Union and China. Those countries were faced with the existential task of not only being able to preserve their basic cultural traditions and civilizations in the midst of modern industrial change, but revitalizing and returning to their civilizational roots like never before. It was precisely because they were ruled by communist parties, and it was precisely because they were guided by the humanistic science of Marxism that industrial progress was made compatible with their basic humanity. And as Americans, and people living in the Western world in general, I think that calls for, at the very least, a reevaluation of what Marxism is. Marxism has gotten a bad rap, and it's taken the blame for something that has ultimately been the creation of liberalism. Marxism is a form of humanism, and real humanism is about embracing, not shunning, our basic human common sense. At the very least, those of us who are interested in actually overcoming the root cause of wokeness have a thing or two to learn from something like Marxism.